oyster shells into Charlotte Harbor today to help boost water quality and help our fish and anglers. The shells act as a natural filter to get toxins out of the ecosystem.
For nearly 2 decades, trucks rolled toward the Gulf Coast of Florida carrying something most people would call garbage. Not chemical waste, not construction debris, just shells. Oyster shells. The kind left behind on a restaurant plate after a dozen on the half shell. Multiply that by millions of meals across hundreds of restaurants and seafood processors year after year, and you start to understand the scale of what was about to happen. Barge after barge carried these shells out into the Gulf of Mexico, where they were tipped overboard onto a seafloor that had been quietly dying for decades. By the time the program wound down, roughly 500,000 tons of shell had gone into the water. And what grew out of that pile of leftovers is something even the people who planned it didn't fully see coming. This is the story of how a state agency's unglamorous recycling effort turned into one of the most talked about ecological recoveries on the American coastline, and why scientists, fishing guides, and coastal engineers are still trying to wrap their heads around how fast it happened. To understand why this project even existed, you have to understand what Florida's Gulf Coast had lost. The Big Bend region, the curve of coastline where the Florida Panhandle meets the peninsula, was once home to sprawling oyster reefs that stretched for miles. These weren't just oyster farms. They were living infrastructure, three-dimensional mazes of shell that filtered water, broke up wave energy, and gave hundreds of species somewhere to live. Over the course of the 20th century, that infrastructure collapsed. Overharvesting stripped reefs faster than oysters could rebuild them. Pollution and runoff smothered what remained. Coastal development reshaped shorelines and currents. By the early 2000s, researchers estimated that the region had lost the overwhelming majority of its historic oyster reef habitat, and the soft, sandy seafloor left behind had almost nothing living on it. That's the part people often miss when they hear oyster reef. An oyster reef isn't really about the oysters themselves. It's about the shell. Living oysters grow on top of dead shell. Baby oysters, called spat, drift through the water as larvae searching for something hard to grab onto. In a healthy system, that hard surface is the accumulated shell of countless previous generations, a self-renewing platform. But once a reef collapses below a certain point, the cycle breaks. There's no shell left for spat to land on, so no new oysters grow, so no new shell gets added, so the reef never recovers on its own. It's a trap, and Florida's Gulf Coast was stuck in it. At the same time, the state had a completely unrelated problem. What to do with the mountains of shucked oyster shells piling up at restaurants and processing plants? Normally, that shell goes straight to a landfill. Someone in Florida's wildlife agencies looked at these two problems side by side and asked an obvious but rarely acted on question. What if the waste from one problem could be the solution to the other? The plan that emerged was almost embarrassingly simple. Collect shucked shells from restaurants and seafood processors across the state. Cure them, drying and aging the shell so it's safe to put back into the water. Load them onto barges, and deposit them at carefully chosen sites along the Gulf, near places like Cedar Key, where currents and water conditions made oyster recovery plausible. Over the better part of 2 decades, that simple loop, restaurant to landfill, rerouted to reef, added up to roughly 500,000 tons of recycled shell returned to the Gulf. If you only heard about this program after the results came in, you might assume it was universally celebrated from day one. It wasn't. When the first shell deposits began, the response from a lot of local communities was skepticism at best, hostility at worst. Environmental advocates worried this was simply ocean dumping with a friendlier name, that the agencies involved were using restoration as cover for offloading waste into the sea. Commercial fishermen, many of whom had worked these waters for generations, were openly worried that piling shell onto the seafloor would smother whatever bottom habitat still existed, disrupt currents, or bury productive fishing grounds under mound of debris. These weren't fringe complaints. They came from people who had spent their entire working lives reading these waters, and who had watched outside interventions go wrong before. Even within the scientific teams running the project, expectations were modest. The honest goal in the beginning wasn't build a thriving ecosystem in record time. It was closer to see if any of this shell becomes useful substrate at all, instead of going to a landfill where it does nothing. Standard timelines for artificial reef projects, whether built from concrete, limestone boulders, or sunken vessels, usually call for years before any meaningful biological activity shows up, and even longer before fish populations respond in a measurable way. So when monitoring teams went back out to the first deposition sites about a year and a half after the initial drops, they were bracing for slow progress, or possibly none at all. What they found instead caught nearly everyone off guard. Here's the detail that almost never makes it into the popular version of this story, but it's the key to everything that followed. The first organisms to respond to all that dumped shell weren't fish, and they weren't even oysters. They were bacteria. Within days, not months, days of shell hitting the Gulf floor, microbial communities began forming thin living films across the shell surfaces. Biologists call this a biofilm, a structured layer of microorganisms that clings to a surface and changes its chemistry and texture. To the naked eye, a shell covered in biofilm doesn't look like much. Under a microscope, it's the beginning of an entire ecosystem's foundation. There's also a chemical piece to this that's easy to overlook. Oyster shells are made mostly of a mineral called aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate that slowly dissolves in seawater. As that dissolution happens, it releases calcium ions into the water immediately around the shell, creating tiny localized zones where the water chemistry is slightly different, generally more favorable for other shell-building organisms like barnacles, tube worms, and young oysters to attach and start forming their own hard structures. In other words, the shells weren't just sitting there as passive surfaces waiting to be colonized. Their own slow chemical breakdown was actively helping to create the conditions other organisms needed to move in. Within weeks, diatoms and microalgae began settling into those biofilms, forming the bottom rung of a food web. Tiny crustaceans and the larval stages of various mollusks followed, grazing on that algae. Those grazers, in turn, became food for the first juvenile fish exploring the new structure. Each layer fed the next, building outward from something invisible to the human eye. Compare that to what was happening on the soft, sandy seafloor just a few feet away from these shell piles. Nothing. Sand doesn't offer a surface for biofilms to anchor to in the same way. It doesn't create localized chemical microenvironments. It has no structural complexity for anything to hide in or attach to. The bare Gulf bottom wasn't failing to recover because nothing wanted to live there. It was failing because there was nothing for life to build on. The shell deposits didn't slowly improve that situation. They bypassed it completely the moment they hit the water. By the time the first formal surveys came back, water samples and sediment cores from the shell sites were already showing a fully established microbial and microalgal ecosystem, something that, on a traditional artificial reef, often takes far longer to develop, if it develops in a recognizable way at all. To anyone standing on a boat looking down at the water, the site still looked like piles of old shell. But underneath the surface, an entire chain of life had already quietly switched on. Once that microscopic scaffolding was in place, the next phase followed quickly, and this is the part that mattered most for the long-term trajectory of the whole project, because it's the part that's self-perpetuating. Remember the trap described earlier? No hard surface, no spat settlement, no new oysters, no new shell, no recovery. The newly deposited shell broke that cycle instantly. Each pile of recycled shell became, in effect, a landing pad placed exactly where Gulf currents would naturally carry drifting oyster larvae. Within the first year, researchers monitoring the sites documented juvenile oysters attaching to the shell in numbers well beyond what cautious early projections had assumed. And because oysters reproduce relatively quickly, the timeline compounded. Larvae that settled in year 1 were mature, reproducing adults by year 2, adding a second generation of larvae to the water, much of which settled right back onto the same expanding shell structure. By the time a few years had passed, density surveys on these restored sites were showing oyster populations dramatically higher than anything found on the surrounding bare seafloor, where, predictably, almost nothing had managed to establish itself at all. What's striking is that this growth didn't stay confined to the original footprint of the dumped shell. As oysters within the reef lived out their life cycles, died, and left their shells behind, those shells became substrate for the next wave of larvae, sometimes settling just beyond the edge of the original pile. The reef began growing both vertically, as layers of shell built up on top of each other, and horizontally, as the edges crept outward into previously bare seafloor. Human effort had created the starting conditions. From that point on, the reef was largely building itself. This is also where local skepticism started to crack. Charter captains and longtime fishing guides, some of the loudest early critics of the shell deposition program, began noticing something they hadn't expected to see: fish. Not just passing through, But holding, schooling, and feeding around these shell mounds in numbers some described as unlike anything they'd seen in decades on those waters. For people whose livelihoods depended on knowing exactly where fish congregated and why, that kind of first-hand observation carried real weight, sometimes more than a research paper ever could. Fish are quick to exploit new structure. The moment a featureless stretch of seafloor develops complexity, nooks, overhangs, gaps between clusters of shell, fish populations respond, often faster than almost any other part of an ecosystem. Within a couple of years of these reefs becoming established, fish surveys around the restored sites were showing substantial increases in both the total amount of fish biomass and the variety of species present, compared to nearby control areas with no shell structure. And this is where the science gets genuinely interesting, because there's an important distinction researchers had to untangle: the difference between fish aggregation and fish production. Plenty of artificial reefs, sunken ships, concrete modules, piles of rubble attract fish. They give existing fish populations somewhere new and interesting to gather, which can make survey numbers spike dramatically without any actual increase in the overall fish population. It's redistribution, not growth. A reef like that can look impressive in a single survey, while doing nothing for the broader health of a fishery. The oyster shell reefs were doing something different. A meaningful share of the increase wasn't existing fish relocating. It was juvenile fish, born in the surrounding waters, surviving to maturity in habitat that simply hadn't existed before. The reefs weren't just concentrating life that was already there. They were producing new life generation after generation, because the structure and food web now supported survival rates that the bare seafloor never could. Species responded in roughly the order you'd expect from an ecosystem rebuilding itself in layers. Predatory fish that hunt using structure for cover and ambush moved in early, using the complex shell terrain to hide and feed. Species that graze on the invertebrates coating hard surfaces, barnacles, small crustaceans, worms, followed close behind, drawn by an abundant and growing food source. Flatfish worked the sandy edges where reef met open bottom. And over time, species that hadn't been seen in meaningful numbers in those waters for years started reappearing. The ripple effects went well beyond the water. Charter operators who had once opposed these projects began actively requesting new shell deposition sites near their favorite fishing grounds. Local businesses, bait shops, marinas, waterfront restaurants reported a noticeable uptick tied to increased fishing activity around the restored reefs. And the ecological cascade kept climbing the food chain. Octopuses moved into the gaps and crevices of the reef structure. Sea turtles began foraging on the invertebrate communities living there, and dolphins were observed working the reef edges, hunting the dense concentrations of fish the reef had helped create. Every new species that arrived added another layer to the food web, and every added layer made the system a little more stable and a little more resistant to disruption. The reef wasn't just growing bigger. It was growing more complicated. And in ecology, complexity is often the difference between a system that's fragile and one that can absorb a shock. While all of this was happening above and around the reef, something else was changing that had nothing to do with fish at all: the water itself. A single adult oyster filters somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 50 gallons of seawater every single day, pulling in suspended particles, excess nutrients, and microorganisms as it feeds. Now multiply that by the oyster populations growing across these restored reef sites, populations in the hundreds of thousands. The math adds up quickly. Collectively, these reefs were processing an enormous volume of Gulf water on a daily basis, functioning as a continuous, distributed filtration system that required no pumps, no electricity, and no maintenance budget. That mattered enormously for a region with a chronic water quality problem. Like much of the Gulf Coast, the waters around Cedar Key receive a steady inflow of nutrients from agricultural and urban runoff, nitrogen and phosphorus that, in excess, fuel algal blooms. Those blooms cloud the water, block sunlight, deplete oxygen as they decay, and have been linked to fish kills up and down the coast for decades. It's one of the most persistent and frustrating problems in coastal water management, precisely because the sources of the nutrients are spread across an entire watershed and nearly impossible to fully control. The oyster reefs didn't solve that problem at its source, but they attacked it at the receiving end, continuously pulling nutrients and particles out of the water column as part of normal feeding. Over a period of just a few years, researchers monitoring water quality around the restored sites documented measurable improvements: greater water clarity, higher dissolved oxygen levels, and reduced nutrient concentrations. And critically, these improvements didn't stay confined to the immediate footprint of the reef. They radiated outward, gradually improving water quality across a widening area around each site. Clearer water set off a second feedback loop that turned out to be just as important as the first. Seagrass, a foundational habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, needs sunlight to grow, and sunlight can't penetrate cloudy water. As the reefs improved clarity, seagrass beds began expanding into areas that had previously been too murky to support them. Seagrass, in turn, stabilizes sediment on the seafloor, which reduces the amount of sediment getting stirred up into the water column, which further improves clarity, which allows seagrass to expand even more. One feedback loop triggered another, and the combined effect spread well beyond where the original shells had been dropped. Researchers who try to put a dollar figure on these filtration and water quality benefits arrived at estimates in the tens of millions of dollars, representing the cost of mechanical infrastructure that would be required to replicate what these reefs were doing for free, continuously, with zero operating cost. It's worth sitting with that for a second. A program that started because nobody wanted to keep paying to landfill restaurant waste ended up generating an ecosystem service worth far more than the cost of the entire program. The idea behind all of this picked up a name among researchers and coastal planners: circular environmental design. The principle that materials typically treated as waste, whether oyster shells, coral fragments, or crushed limestone, can be deliberately repurposed as functional ecological infrastructure. Not as a stopgap measure, but as a legitimate design strategy in its own right. And the model didn't stay confined to Florida. Shell recycling and reef building programs expanded along the Gulf Coast and neighboring states, and similar principles have been applied in restoration efforts as far away as urban harbors on the East Coast, places dealing with pollution levels Florida's Gulf Coast never had to contend with. For all the encouraging trends in fish counts and water clarity, there was one test that no monitoring schedule could predict, and no research design could simulate: a major hurricane. In September 2017, Hurricane Irma tore through Florida as a powerful storm, bringing sustained winds well over 100 miles per hour and a storm surge capable of reshaping shorelines overnight. Coastal communities throughout the Big Bend region braced for the kind of erosion that storms of this intensity reliably produce: beaches stripped bare, shorelines pushed back, infrastructure damaged by waves with nothing to slow them down before they hit the coast. When damage assessment teams went out after the storm passed, the comparison between protected and unprotected shorelines was hard to miss. Stretches of coast backed by the restored oyster reefs showed meaningfully less erosion than nearby unprotected shorelines with no reef structure offshore. The reefs had functioned as natural wave breaks, their dense, irregular, three-dimensional surfaces absorbing and dissipating wave energy before it ever reached the shore at full force. There's no smooth surface on a living oyster reef for a wave to glide along uninterrupted. Instead, there's friction, layer after layer of shell and living oyster breaking up the wave's momentum bit by bit. This is also where the cost comparison becomes genuinely remarkable. The entire multi-decade shell deposition program had cost in the range of a few $1 million total. Engineers estimating the avoided property damage from reduced erosion during a single major storm arrived at a figure in the same ballpark, meaning the reefs had effectively paid for a meaningful share of their own construction costs in the course of one hurricane. And there's something the reefs can do that traditional shoreline armoring, seawalls, riprap, concrete bulkheads, simply cannot. Those structures are static. They crack, corrode, shift, and degrade over time, and once damaged, they need to be repaired or replaced at significant expense. Oyster reefs are the opposite. Storm damage to a reef often triggers a new wave of larval settlement, as fresh shell surfaces and disturbed habitat create new opportunities for spat to attach. Each subsequent generation add height and structural complexity. In a strange way, a reef like this can come out of a storm stronger than it went in, a self-repairing barrier that improves with age and with stress, rather than degrading. For coastal engineers and planners who had spent careers working with hard infrastructure, that's a difficult thing to argue against. The traditional logic of shoreline protection, expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and prone to failure under exactly the conditions it's meant to handle, suddenly had a living, self-funding, self-repairing alternative sitting right offshore. Maybe the most remarkable part of this whole story is what happened after the active phase of the program wound down, because the reefs didn't stop. By the early 2020s, some of the oldest deposition sites had grown substantially beyond their original footprint, expanding outward in multiple directions without any additional shell being added by people. The mechanism is simple once you understand the oyster life cycle. Each generation settles on existing shell, grows, reproduces, eventually dies, and leaves behind its own shell as substrate for the next generation. Vertical growth comes from layers building on top of each other. Horizontal growth comes from larvae settling just beyond the current edge of the reef, on shell that's accumulated there from nearby growth. Run that cycle for a decade and a half, and a reef that started as a loose, irregular mound of dump shell becomes something architecturally complex. Vertical faces, overhangs, gaps, and crevices at every scale, creating dozens of distinct microhabitats within what used to be a single pile of debris. Researchers have also started looking at these reefs through a climate lens. Dense accumulations of oyster shell and the sediment around them can act as a sink for organic carbon, locking away material that might otherwise break down and contribute to greenhouse gas emissions or ocean acidification. That's not why this program was started, but it's increasingly part of how oyster reef restoration is being discussed, not just as habitat recovery or coastal defense, but as a small piece of a much larger climate puzzle. At the more mature sites, biodiversity measurements have been approaching levels associated with healthy, naturally occurring limestone reef habitat, the kind of benchmark that restoration projects rarely get close to, let alone within a couple of decades. The Gulf isn't just hosting these reefs anymore. In a real sense, it's rebuilding itself around them. While the reefs themselves continue rebuilding around the Gulf, each oyster that lives and dies adding to a structure that keeps expanding, filtering more water, sheltering more species, and absorbing more wave energy than it did the year before. That's the part that's hardest to plan for and easiest to underestimate. A system that, once started, no longer needs the people who started it. The intervention ended years ago. The ecosystem didn't. It's still running, still growing, and by most projections, it's likely to keep doing both for decades to come. Step back from the details, and the shape of this story is almost strange in its simplicity. A state agency took something that was, by any normal definition, waste, shells that would otherwise have gone to a landfill, and put it back into an ocean that had been stripped of the very thing it needed most, hard surface. Within days, bacteria moved in. Within weeks, a food web began assembling itself. Within a year, oysters were settling in numbers that outpaced expectations. Within a few years, fish populations weren't just gathering. They were being born and surviving there in ways the bare seafloor had never allowed. The water got clearer. Seagrass expanded. And when a major hurricane arrived to test all of it, the reefs didn't just survive. They protected the shorelines behind them and came out the other side positioned to grow even more. None of this required ongoing intervention once the shell was in place. No fertilizing, no stocking, no engineered maintenance. The system did what living systems do when you remove the barrier that's been stopping them. It grew, and it kept growing on its own schedule, faster than almost anyone involved expected. It's worth asking the obvious question this story leaves behind. How many other coastlines in Florida and far beyond it are sitting on the same kind of trapped potential, degraded not because nature has given up, but because something simple and solvable is missing? If 500,000 tons of leftover shell could do this much in less than 2 decades, it raises a genuinely open question about what else might be possible if more places were willing to try something this unglamorous, this cheap, and, as it turns out, this effective.